we're going to look, I call it a virtual tour of this region, well, actually the country, but focused on this region in this story of Underground Railroad and anti-slavery activity. For this week, we're going to talk about an overview nationally of what this movement was all about. And next week, as you will see here, we're going to focus on St. James, the other downtown ministries, how they grappled with the issue of slavery and where these secretive and or sometimes very open activities called Underground Railroad occurred in our community. This is always the question, because this story, this chapter of our history, really is only emerged for decent study in the second half of the 20th century. There wasn't hardly anything done to it in the early 20th century, but as the civil rights movement grew, we have to try to figure out what is it that we really know. My work with the African American Historical Society of South Central Pennsylvania, which is a ad hoc group, kind of operates under the umbrella and under the aegis of a lot of different organizations. You can see on that brochure I sent around for the tours we do. Those are the groups that we work with. So we're filtering this information and trying to make it more relatable to the public and of interest, especially to young people, and to bring alive these stories. So we look at 1780 as a key jump-off point, and then with the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, this whole system seemed to, such as it was a system, seems to have subsided and gone away. And the numbers are not that large in terms of, but we will never know the numbers probably about actually how many people escaped enslavement in the South and got freedom in the North or elsewhere. Those are the numbers that you see throughout the literature on this subject material. But against a population like this, these many people, in percentages of the population, it's a relatively small, but it was a vast irritant. The escape of these very valuable commodities, this property that people deigned to claim, was really a problem. And these people were polarized badly on either side of this whole issue. But in Lancaster County, interesting, larger percentage of the total population than the averages I just showed you across the range of dates. 23% is the number that relates to, I guess. And it grew in that time period up to the end of the 18th century. By the way, you'll see the name Mark Ebersol again. Who knows Mark Ebersol? There you go, Leo. I knew Leo now. Former president of Elizabethtown College, and I'm not sure, he did a lot of writing for the Lancaster County Historical Society Journal on these subject material, religion and slavery times. But like issues we're dealing with today, the tumultuous situation of broken families, everything I've been reading and understanding as I learn more and more about this is what created the tripwire, the cross line, the breaking of the camel's back to these families that they had to put up with. They put up with so much for so many centuries, but when it got to be mass separation of families, that's when people said we have to get out of here in any way, shape, or form we can. Excuse me. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution seemed to be an emerging point of when people started admitting to telling these stories of this patently illegal process and system called the Underground Railroad. All men got the right to vote in 1870. And that seemed to liberate the people's understandings of what happened in the previous 30, 40, 50 years, and to be able to say, we are citizens, we are full citizens now. At least that was the aspiration at the time. They seemed to give an allowance to people to start talking about these things again, which was basically illegal, very illegal. Most of what we know, so you see 1870, am I doing that? Sorry. 1870 was that date of the 15th Amendment, spring of 1870, and these were the authors in the subsequent 20 years who started documenting stories on a large scale. William Still, African-American gentleman who was the head of the Vigilance Society in Philadelphia, where so many people came to tell their stories, and he documented them all. Dr. Smedley was a Quaker who wrote about this region, and Siebert was a professor of history from Ohio. So you see the dates. They all basically absorbed the previous author's information, added their own research, doing what I'm doing here today, telling more stories, sharing with you, and I'm sure we'll share some stories back and forth. The overall take you get on this whole subject material is this. It sprang up all over. It was organic. Nobody knows where it started. It was just a mass uprising. That's true to some extent, but also I think we need to have some kind of filtering of the overall subject material, which I found to be very well done in Fergus Bordowich's 2005 book, which I guess could be considered the latest national credible treatment of this particular story. His take is, it was the nation's first civil rights movement in the aftermath of the revolution. Racially inspired, religiously inspired and racially integrated. That was free Africans and white people working together to receive the newcomers, to help them along the way, to assimilate, help along the way in that large grand scale over large landscape areas. First instance of mass civil disobedience in the wake of the revolution. He goes further and says, this is the first time black folks got involved in politics and organizing community affairs and events, because they had to. They had to find ways to work with each other and with the larger white majority community. And this also was critical because the 15th Amendment gave men the right to vote, regardless of color, but women were shoulder to shoulder with the guys in those trenches fighting this anti-slavery, creating these underground railroad systems. And they had to wait, you all had to wait till 1920, right, for your vote. Anybody been to the museum in DC, the latest museum? It is phenomenal. You've got to go, and you've got to spend more than a day if you can. But it's hard to get in there, and it is just remarkable. It is absolutely remarkable. But they did a very modest, very small treatment of Underground Railroad, which I haven't really inquired as to why that is. They go into incredible detail on so many things, but they don't go into a big exposition about Underground Railroad. This is one of the most startling things that I found in that time when we went a couple of years ago. The American Revolution. The British were saying to black men, join our side because we are going to end slavery sooner than the colonial guys will. And those are the numbers of people who served in uniform or in military support capacity during the Revolution, according to the African American Museum. And what they did was, let's see, I went backwards, didn't I? Sorry. What happened, I believe, during those military campaigns, when freed Africans who may have always been free in their lives or had some virtual semblance of freedom in the northern states, were in the Army support systems, went south and probably for the first time saw plantation scale, industrial scale slavery, and vice versa. Enslaved people in the South on the massive plantations were always told there's nothing anywhere else besides this community, this plantation, and you'll be in this situation forever. But as part of the military campaign to create these United States, those military support people and soldiers in arms went north for the first time and saw black people living in relative freedom. They saw what pathways to go to. Overlay that with circuit rider preachers of the Methodist Church, we're famous for that. African American Methodist Episcopal priests, ministers, were famous for being circuit riders as well. I believe those ministers created the network and told people, go up this road, go to this house, find this person, knock on a door, whatever, all the kind of word of mouth, grapevine information you would need to escape. I think that's how it probably evolved, and I think other people believe that too. This was a take I just recently absorbed into my treatment of this story, and that is all of the forced migrations of Africans from Africa to here, the other continents, South America, North America, but then the internal forced migrations based on, in this case, the cotton gin, creation of the cotton gin, the invention in 1793, which required more people to be enslaved, to pick more cotton, to put it into the mechanical system to create. I think the United States created, I think I just read, 30% of the world's cotton supply during that period before the Civil War. So all of those people then also were forced to move different areas that they were never allowed to live in before, so they saw new areas that they could go. They probably picked up travel tips on those circumstances. This 1997 thing, the author I showed you before, Fergus Bordowich, he claims this is a good deal of mythology here, or an artistic license, or historian's license, because he claims that people could not have escaped from way down in the south north up into the mid-Atlantic region, nor could they have probably gone overland up the Mississippi Valley to get to Canada. This migration or escape came from the border states around the Confederacy into the free states that were where slavery was abolished. You couldn't really go too far without being tracked and caught and taken back. But around that circle, I believe, is about 60% of the nation's population was about in that general area about this period of time. So therefore, Northern Virginia and Maryland is where most people who came here escaped from. So the Pennsylvania experience was, when you came across the Mason-Dixon line, the border with Maryland, you came into a pretty vast wilderness territory in the years after the Revolution. And these factors, I believe, created a system along our counties of the Mason-Dixon line, the optimum conditions for this a growing systemization or a organization around this effort to take people from one site to the next. Because that's the classic definition of the Underground Railroad. Someone tells you how to get to one place, you go there, person takes you in, gives you some kind of support, food, shelter, clothing, and then tells you how to get to the next site. Safe house to safe house. You're generally walking distance. So when you would come up from the south, after a day or so's walk, and you came all the way from the counties, you hit, right here on the left-hand side is the Cumberland Valley and one of the biggest rises of the Appalachians, above which there was virtually nothing there in the years of the late 18th century. Wilderness, no trains, and all of the transportation networks generally went to Philadelphia direction and east, which is why, as you see on the map that I put on the table there, that Lorraine was like really looking at intensely. Because it's filled with good information and names that you'll hear in this narrative of the story. By the way, I'd like you to pass around those placards that are on the table if you'd like to, and I invite you to take pictures of them so you don't want to read them all now, you can take a picture and read it at home. But you see that migration I just described. Coming north and going due east, you had to come across the bridge at Columbia, mostly. That was the most reliable place you could cross. Then you came through Lancaster, Chester, Delaware, then Philadelphia. And you see this network that was set up. Now this is Wilbur Siebert, the guy from Ohio in the late 1890s, who put together this map based on the previous author's work. So we had these categories of people, these politically aligned, religiously aligned people who seemed to be the leaders in this movement. Temperance leader, absolutely against drinking because of the prevalence at that time of everyday drinking all the time. Anti-Masons, all these different people, and then some religious leaders. So in Pennsylvania, the only colony province in the early United States that opened its doors to any faith communities to worship. All the other colonies generally were dominated by a certain denomination of Christian religion. But Pennsylvania, because of William Penn's imprint, said anybody can come here, which is why we got so many disaffected and marginalized people from Europe who came to settle here. So this was the reflection by the New Era on the 200th anniversary of Lancaster and Lancaster County. Reverend Edward Bailey from Bethel AME, a couple of weeks ago, I went to a presentation on slavery there, and he made this statement that kind of gave me pause, I guess you could say. I think he was saying that we are where we are today in the goodness of this country and our community, as well as the downside of our country, in large measure because of the church's influence. From his standpoint, I get that. And also because you'll hear next week about how Bethel AME came from this church community, and that was the origins of his faith establishment. But according to good old Mr. Mark Ebersol again, quoting a study from a 1964 study, this is the take he puts on the Episcopal denomination. There was not a lot of people speaking out in the pulpit that we know of, at least in this community, which we'll go into more next week. It was said to be secular issue, not religious. So the silence allowed for the continuance and the growth and the continuance of slavery in the Episcopal community, according to this take. Now, I'm sure there's probably we'll find other people. We will find, as a matter of fact, James Buchanan's brother in Chester County, Edward, who we know to have been involved in Underground Railroad activity. So we'll find various individuals, perhaps, and small cadres of people within Episcopal church parishes, but largely, according to this and other takes, the Episcopalians were not out in front. However, Siebert says the Quakers were the go-to people in this particular effort. And in that regard, this area he defines as the hotbed, this area counties west of Philadelphia, where it really did take root. And he had some other denominations in there as well. Now, there's a good understanding that not all Quakers were abolitionists and Underground Railroad operators, but flip that around and you can almost safely say that most Underground Railroad activists in this region were Quakers, because that's the way the predominant people who were engaged in this activity because of their faith traditions. And there's no better, in our terms of our region, this particular incident on the fateful day of September 11th, 1851. That date does repeat itself in history of some very tumultuous events in our community, in our history. It was branded as a riot because anytime black people rose up against the institution of slavery, the popular press called it, marginalized the people and called them terrorists, uprisings, rioters. But we now know today it's more appropriate to call it a resistance against this inhumane and patently unconstitutional institution of slavery. So the incident, precursor to this incident, is a phenomenal outward effort by the Quakers in Bart Township, Lancaster County, in 1850, 10 months before that flashpoint eruption of the Christiana resistance. 6 Quaker leaders in that community, all known Underground Railroad operatives, met in a place called Russell's Hall in Georgetown, the little community center of Bart Township. They went up to an upper floor, and they got together and set up a presiding officers, a recording person, and they created what I call the Georgetown Resolutions. And they published them in the paper. They said it's our Christian duty to not obey this law, that we will defy it, we will help these people as they come through. And a gentleman who I'll introduce you to next week, a member of this parish, branded this episode, this particular publishing of these resolutions, as the flashpoint that allowed the 10-month later Christiana riot or Christiana resistance to erupt. We'll get into that a little bit later. So, politics. Pennsylvania's politics was a great reason why people wanted to come here, where there was a beacon of hope. There was the Gradual Abolition Act, first in the country. Vermont was a territory at the time. They abolished slavery gradually, but Pennsylvania did as well as the first state. I've read one incident in the Western Hemisphere. But if you were born a slave before 1780, you were going to always be a slave, unfortunately. If you were born afterwards, you could work until age 28, which, that's pretty much end of life for many people back then. But black people could get support from organizations legally and openly from, like the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, founded by Ben Franklin in Philadelphia. Now, I'm looking at technology and transportation as part of this whole system, why this region really did take root and gave life to this particular civil rights movement. The Wright's Ferry was like 1730, and the Harris Ferry was 1733, the places you could reliably cross on a westward migration, which is where a lot of people were heading, right? The first turnpike in the country was Philadelphia to Lancaster to Columbia, 1790s, I guess it was. But the reverse is true also, as I showed you in the map there. People coming north in the counties to the west came the same way across that bridge, across the wide, narrow, and very dangerous Susquehanna River. And you have today on 2nd Street in Columbia this phenomenally improved, restored 1738 house, the Wright's Ferry Mansion, which is phenomenal to go and see. So, focusing on, I went backwards again, very sorry. So we have, in this landscape, across these border counties, a great story to tell that is only really recently being put together in a kind of a cohesive package, I guess you could say. And when you look at it from those standpoints of time, technology, people involvement, you have all of these factors coming together at that ferry crossing between Wrightsville and Columbia, creating all of the ingredients for a place that really, I believe, gave rise to the name and the movement we call the Underground Railroad. All of this was branded by none other than our friend, Samuel Evans, the co-author of History of Lancaster County in 1883. But he was a Civil War veteran, a magistrate in Columbia, and also a newspaper correspondent. He wrote reams of stories, again, in the wake of the 15th Amendment, about his involvement, his family's involvement, and all the people in that town of Columbia. His narratives gave rise to those other national authors I showed you earlier. And in all of the maps you can see, oh, look at it. Cheers. And this is a seminal, kind of a latter-day seminal treatment of the Underground Railroad in 1984. Charles Bloxton was the author. He was an African-American Temple University prof whose grandmother was enslaved. This is the National Geographic map. You see Columbia there. And the one I showed you before earlier, Columbia shows up again, because it is such an important storyline where these stories emerged. And again, this is my depiction, the early one you saw, but Philadelphia to Lancaster to Columbia, that was the turnpike that came through in the 1790s. providing relative ease and freedom of transportation back and forth across the, and then this was the river crossing. There was actually 2 bridges that crossed in that time period, one of which was destroyed. The second one was burned by the Union Army to stop the Confederates from coming across. I'm sure many of you know that story. And this is amazing. This is William Whipper, the gentleman you see on the placard I have right here, who was involved as an incredible business person in the years before the Civil War. He writes to William Still a letter in 1871, published a year later, admitting to his involvement in this activity. And he looks at he calls about the best place to cross was that long bridge between Columbia and Wrightsville. And then I love the narrative, he describes this thing here. He says, when you look back over this broad silvery stream, and you say, thus far shalt thou come, and no farther, is the way he wrote in the thing. And you might find that particular passage very similar to this one. So he has been, inspired, obviously. His writings became some of the most fundamental, inspirational writings from the mid-19th century to the civil rights leaders of the mid-20th century. Very much ahead of his time. Okay, so here's some of the narratives you'll always hear. You'll hear lecturers and professors and people say, this movement was not about actual underground places. But I would say that might be true in a lot of places around the country. But I believe here we have, again, this unique set of factors that have come together to create what I believe is the organizational apparatus that took root here, if not the earliest, some of the earliest in the entire country. We have so many bank barns, bridges underneath the bank barns in Pennsylvania, unique architecture to this area. This is Drumore Township. Joseph Smith, Quaker, goes back to the early 1800s. The family sold the property, and a gentleman who tore a lot of it apart but rebuilt it, made the same thing. He kept that space under there. The family traditions are that was a space where people could find and told to go there after it's only a few miles from the river, maybe a mile or so. They were told to go there, and Quaker Joseph Smith will let you in and hide you until you get to the next spot. And that's where they appear to have put them. Down the road a little ways in Fulton Township, you have the Haynes Farm. The same deal. You see the bridge underneath the stone bank barn? Those cold storage areas were for where you put your turnips and your potatoes to feed your cattle across the wintertime. But people also used them to hide. They would seal off that opening and hide people inside of there. I know 3 or 4 others in Lancaster County that did that. And this is pretty much the only area in the country, from Lehigh Valley down to the Maryland line, where this particular architecture exists in concentrated form. And we do know now also that likely, possibly in the back side of the convention center, the project I was involved in several years ago, hiring James Dell, the archaeologist you see here, the cisterns there, the theory by the archaeologists is that that was an emergency hiding place as part of this whole system, while Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith owned and operated those properties. And you can see inside of there, that underground water holding tank was no longer needed for domestic water supply. When public water came into the street, they modified it, apparently, and created an opening inside that archtop cistern that allowed someone to jump into that place and hide. That's the archaeologist's theory. We're still trying to prove that. The other thing they keep saying, it's not about real railroads. But I'm saying that may, again, be the case elsewhere. But here we have really absolutely certified by the National Park Service that the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, the second operating railroad in the country after Baltimore and Ohio, was actually used for this purpose. And again, we have Mr. Whipper testifying in that same letter. He said when people came to him from across the river or from wherever, he and his partners, Stephen Smith in Columbia, would send the fork of the road was the road of the Underground Railroad. Some they sent their boats, which was the canal boats I showed you on the earlier map. There were canal boats that connected to that area and the railroads. And some we sent you in our cars, meaning train cars. Now it's important to understand that he's talking about what's called the main line of public works. We still call the train line out of Philly, the main line. This is where the name came from. The first across Pennsylvania infrastructure built by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But if you were a railroad operator and you hauled passengers or freight, you had your own privately owned cars and you paid a fee to the engine, the conductor, to pull that train wherever you wanted to go. That's what allowed Mr. Whipper and Smith to do some very ingenious things on this system that allowed you to get from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in a couple of days. So, Mr. Evans over here and here, we see he testifies, writes in the public press in 1870, before any of these other big National Underground Railroad books come out. He says that boxcars belonging to lumber boxcars, because lumber was the mainstay of Smith and Whipper. That's where they made their money. They had these private things, and they had a false end inside their boxcars, and they transported people from Columbia to Philadelphia in all of 8 hours, which would have been like speed back then. And this artist's depiction, you can walk on the trail of the old train line, the old Philadelphia Columbia train line, and go up right behind the Arts Hotel, and this is the marker that we've installed a couple of years ago there that describes, and Mike Abel, the really gifted artist in town, he worked with us and came up with this depiction of what those words in Samuel Evans' description might have looked like inside these train cars, where from you put a false wall inside there and have a small space behind them and hide maybe 3 people inside of there and ship them. These Whipper and Smith had, I think, 20 boxcars of their own, and they could have moved that many people. They were never caught, by the way. And we believe it happened beginning in 1838 and went up into the 1850s. Okay, I'm almost done. How about that? Everybody here still with me? Nobody's still? I don't see anybody. Martha, wake up, Martha. Martha's seen this a few times, so we're still not clear. No one claims where this thing started or who came up with that mysterious name, okay? So with the magic of being able to scan zillions of newspapers these days on the internet, this is the earliest one I found in print. If you notice the term down there it's in quotation marks and it's lowercase, meaning it hasn't become an institutionalized system named yet. So this is probably one of the earliest. And you see the earliest in the Abolitionist press, where they're taunting the Southern slave owners to say, we are operating this mysterious system and you'll never see these people again, and give it up and all that. And this is the first time, a few years later, when the first imagery, again, satirical depiction from a Chicago newspaper.
What month was that?
Month of which? The imprint?
The first one, yeah.
This was April?
April what?
April 1843.
Okay.
So,
because Wrightsville's saying 30 cents.
Wrightsville, I'm sorry.
Down south, Columbia, across the river.
Okay.
Yeah, Columbia is saying that their record has 1836.
As being what?
The time that they were saying that in print they were reporting that it appears that there was a railroad between Wrightsville and Columbia, because that was where it appeared that Negroes that were in Wrightsville on Saturday were found in Columbia on Sunday.
Okay. I'll be glad to look up that, maybe, because again, you always find more things, you find new information all the time, and you have to change the narrative. Because again, this is what I found, but I'm sure people may have found an earlier thing in print, for sure. And this, who inspired this newspaper artist in Chicago to depict this thing about a train actually going underground? Which is what the current movie that's coming out based on Colson Whitehead's, what I call a Harry Potter-esque kind of a treatment of this whole story, that I think muddies the water for a lot of young people about what this system was all about. Where it was, you may have been underground places where you hid, as I showed you, but a lot of people believe you go down and you come up on hundreds of miles away. This book, I showed you 3 authors before, Still, this guy Smedley, and Siebert. This guy in 1883, anecdotally, says that his interviews that he did, came up with around 1830s, someone came up with this name. When the slave catchers came to Columbia, there was such a support system, such a secretive operation going on, that they seem to have just gone off on an underground railroad. That's his quote in print in 1883. So again, it's a lot later than what we saw that term used in the newspapers. But again, we're dealing with murky past that hasn't been totally plumbed for all of the research and history available. It's out there, but we're still not sure where the movement started. If you go on the National Park Service site, this is what they'll say. We don't know where it started. We don't know who came up with the name. But leaving it open to potential operations and more research. But there are 3 places where the name seems to have originated in all the popular accounts so far. Ripley, Ohio, across the Ohio River from slave state Kentucky to Ohio. There's an episode in Washington, D.C., supposedly in the 1840s, when a guy used that term, and in Columbia, as I showed you before. So, in wrapping up here, flashpoints, I'd like you to think about, this is leading to next week's presentation. Think about flashpoints in history, wars, social, political movements, in this case, assassination that led to a war. There's always some kind of one incident that happens that soon thereafter, a historian or a journalist will give a name to it, and everybody starts using that term, right? Remember World War I was first called the Great War until Second World War. So we give names to things so we're able to transfer knowledge about that particular thing. But it always seems to be these kind of like instances. Some of them planned, some of them spontaneous. The one we're dealing with most recently, the Arab Spring, where this guy burned himself alive protesting an autocratic taxation issue. He couldn't feed his family, so he kills himself, and that spirals out of control and gets to that degree. So next week I'll tell you about this gentleman, a son of St. James, Thomas Bowd, those birth years, that's his pedigree, that's his background. Incredibly accomplished, amazing public figure whose name is not on that plaque outside on the side of our wall, and we're still not trying to figure out why. I'm thinking maybe because he's not buried here. That when that was all put together, he was gone from here because he left here in the 1790s to stake his claim in Colombia on that riverfront. And the story that will unfold, the flashpoint that I'm going to describe, was up until 2011, was on the National Park Service website that our friend Leo found when I collaborated with Leo a couple of years ago, and I first tried to put my brain around what this is all meaning. Leo found the website of the National Park Service which gave those words on it. And Martha and Catherine and I went to Topeka, Kansas, where the nation's, in an elementary school, is converted into the nation's civil rights museum that described where the Brown versus Board of Education case started, that segregated school system. In that series of chronologies, in that series of videos and displays, they put this on their chronology wall. And it's no longer on there because I believe I submitted an application to the National Park Service to commemorate Bowd's grave in Columbia, and they did not agree with this interpretation. It was done probably in the 1980s. So this, if you go on the National Park Service site, you will not see this anymore, which I found kind of distressing from my standpoint. But the point is, this was accepted by two very credible authors from the mid-20th century, two African-American authors, John Hope Franklin and a woman named Elsie Buckmaster. And I'll tell you about them next week. But this is the idea. Was he involved in a spontaneous uprising against slavery that set in motion the system of Underground Railroad, anti-slavery and Underground Railroad activity that someone later branded Underground Railroad? So back to where we are with the church. And I think I will end right there because we're going to talk about the church next week and everything involved.